My name is Mallory K. Sloan, and I'm 29 years old. I never thought my parents could be so selfish. Not to that extent. Sure, they'd always favored my older sister Clara and doted on my younger brother Eli, but I didn't think they'd put me on the spot like this. Not on Thanksgiving. Not in front of the entire family. Dinner was in full swing, the table heavy with perfectly roasted turkey, buttery mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce that still had the faint ridges from the can. My mom had gone all out as usual, every detail screaming, perfect family holiday. I should have known better than to let the decorations fool me. About halfway through the meal, just as my Uncle Mason was telling some long-winded story about his fishing trip, my mom cleared her throat. That sound, small, deliberate, made the air shift. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a shiny set of car keys. I watched her eyes flick to Eli, who was busy trying to cut through an overly dry slice of turkey like the turkey had personally offended him. "For our son," my mom said, holding the keys up for everyone to see. The polished metal caught the soft glow of the chandelier, the one with a bright future ahead. Eli looked up, fork hovering awkwardly midair. His face went red immediately, the way it always did when attention landed on him too hard. Clara leaned back in her chair, already smirking. My dad topped off his wine glass, suddenly very focused on the bottle's label. And I felt it. The eyes. Half the table swung toward me, the unspoken comparison hanging thick in the air. My mom set the keys down in front of Eli. He didn't reach for them right away. He glanced at me instead, uncomfortable. He hadn't asked for this, and I knew it. He was 20, a college kid still trying to figure out who he even was. He wasn't the problem. But my mom wasn't done. "You're not getting a seat at the table this year," she said, tone sharp and deliberate, like she was delivering a verdict. "Not after you refuse to help your brother." The room went dead silent. The only sound was the soft clink of my uncle's fork hitting his plate. Heat rushed into my face so fast it felt like someone had slapped me. I didn't need to ask what she meant. A few months back, my parents had casually mentioned they expected me to cover Eli's $60,000 student loan debt because I had a steady job, had paid off my own loans, and bought my first house. Because I had finally crawled out of the financial quicksand of my 20s, and they decided that meant I owed them a rescue mission. When I told them no, that I couldn't and wouldn't take on that kind of burden, my mom went cold. My dad muttered something about family loyalty. Clara smirked, like she was watching a show. But this was a new low. Eli's face turned a painful shade of pink. Panic flickered in his eyes. He looked like he wanted to sink into his chair and disappear. My dad kept his eyes on his plate, swirling his wine like the answer might be hidden in the glass. Clara crossed her arms, clearly enjoying the moment. I glanced around the table. Aunt Lydia shifted uncomfortably. My cousin Jonah shot me a sympathetic look. My grandfather shook his head slowly, disappointment carved deep into his face. Uncle Mason finally broke the silence, setting his fork down with a clatter. "Now hold on," he said. "That's not fair. Mallory isn't responsible for anyone else's debt." My mom shot him a withering look, eyes narrowing as she prepared to fire back. "Family is supposed to support each other," she said, voice tightening. "That's what this is about." I felt something rise in my chest, heat and pressure, the kind that makes your pulse pound in your ears. For a second, I imagined every possible response. The speech I could make, the facts I could throw like knives, the years I could unpack in front of everyone. But I also knew my mother. She would thrive on the chaos. Twist my anger into proof I was difficult. Use it to make herself the victim. So I did the only thing she couldn't weaponize. I smiled. Not a big smile, just a small one. I set down my fork, pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the polished wood floor. I looked at Eli and gave him a tiny nod, just enough to tell him I didn't blame him. Then I turned and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word. I just left, the cold November air hitting me as I stepped outside, my breath coming out in sharp, angry clouds. That night I barely slept. I replayed the moment over and over, each repetition tightening the knot in my chest. I thought about all the years I'd put my family first, all the sacrifices, the late nights, the times I showed up when no one else did. And this was how they repaid me, by trying to publicly shame me into paying $60,000. By treating me like an ATM because I finally managed to get my life together. By telling me I didn't deserve a seat at the table unless I paid for it. By morning something in me had gone quiet. The kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. And I was done being their safety net. I didn't wake up the next morning with regret. I woke up with clarity, the kind that doesn't shout. It just settles in your bones like a decision you should have made years ago. I made coffee in my own kitchen, in my own house, and I let the silence sit around me without trying to fill it. No group text, no apology, no, let's talk. Just the memory of my mother's voice. You're not getting a seat at the table this year, still hanging in the air like smoke. And I realized something so simple it almost made me laugh. They thought humiliation was leverage. They thought embarrassment would break me. They'd forgotten who they raised. Not because they knew me well, because they trained me to be the one who handles problems, the one who figures it out, the one who does what needs to be done when everyone else is panicking. Fine. I handled it, just not for them. I made a few calls, pulled a few strings, the kind of boring administrative moves that don't look dramatic while they're happening, but change everything once they land. By the time my parents woke up, their world had started to unravel. The garage door wouldn't budge. A thick, official-looking notice was slapped across it in bright red letters. Seized property. Do not tamper. My mom, in her robe, hair still twisted up from sleep, stared at it like the words were written in another language. My dad stood behind her, pressing the garage remote again and again, like rage could make the mechanism obey. Clara's voice floated in from the kitchen, irritated and sharp. What is going on? We have places to be. And Eli, sweet, overwhelmed Eli, was probably standing there clutching those new keys like they were suddenly made of guilt. I didn't have to imagine much for long, because the voicemails started immediately. At first, they were confused. Mallory, is this some kind of mistake? Call me back, right now. Your mother is freaking out. Then they turned angry. Why would you do this? This is childish. You've gone too far. By noon, my dad's messages were stacked like bricks. 41 voicemails. I counted, not because I cared, but because the number felt like a symbol, like a tally mark of how desperate they were when the control wasn't in their hands anymore. My mom's calls came in bursts, 5 in a row, then 10 minutes of silence, then 5 more, each one shorter and sharper, like she was burning through oxygen. I let them ring. Graham sat across from me at the table, watching my phone light up and go dark. You sure? He asked quietly. I took a slow sip of coffee. I've never been more sure. The first thing my parents discovered after the locked garage was that the insurance tied to their vehicles and their little family business account had been frozen under a sudden compliance audit. My mom tried calling the dealership first, thinking someone could just override reality the way she overrides conversations. No one could. That's the thing about paperwork. It doesn't care if you're the matriarch. It doesn't respond to guilt. It doesn't flinch when you raise your voice. I expected the calls to start early, but I didn't pick up until the 5th attempt, more out of curiosity than mercy. Mallory, my mother snapped, voice high and strained. What is going on? Why is our garage locked? Why are our accounts frozen? Is this some kind of sick joke? I leaned back on my couch, stretching my legs out, letting the quiet satisfaction settle into my chest. It's not a joke, Mom, I said. It's business. There was a sputtering silence on the other end. Business, she repeated. We're your family. Funny, I said calmly. I thought family meant mutual respect, not publicly humiliating your daughter in front of everyone, not treating me like an ATM just because I managed to get my life together. I could hear my dad in the background, muffled, confused questions stacking up behind her. My mom lowered her voice like she was trying to regain control. This isn't the way to handle things. You've taken it too far. I almost laughed. Too far. After years of bending until I couldn't recognize my own spine, this was too far. You wanted to teach me a lesson at dinner, I said, keeping my tone even, about loyalty, about support. Consider this my lesson to you. A long pause. I could hear her breathing, tight and furious. Actions have consequences, I added. Then I hung up. The family chat exploded by late afternoon. Aunt Lydia, quiet for years, finally snapped, calling my mom out for trying to shame me at Thanksgiving. Uncle Mason poured gasoline on it, typing out exactly what everyone was thinking, but usually too polite to say. If anyone needed a reality check, it was my parents. Clara tried to steer the conversation back into their usual narrative. Mallory is dramatic. Mallory always thinks she's better. Mallory is selfish. But something was different this time, because there were witnesses. They'd seen my mom slide keys across the table like a trophy. They'd heard her exile me, like I was a servant who refused to pay. They'd seen me stand up silently and leave. My grandparents called that night. I braced myself for disappointment. Instead, my grandmother's voice came through soft but steady. Honey, she said, your mother's raising hell, saying you've gone rogue, but I heard what really happened. My throat tightened. Don't let them bully you, she continued. You're doing the right thing. My grandfather got on the line next. He didn't waste words. Proud of you, he said. Those 3 words meant more than 1,000 apologies from my parents ever could. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. Because I knew my parents. They wouldn't back down. They'd retaliate. They always did when they lost control. And I was right. A few days later, I came home from work and found my front door wide open. My heart dropped so fast it felt like my body forgot how to breathe. I rushed inside, mind jumping to the worst. Nothing was stolen, but everything was wrong. My books were stacked haphazardly. Framed photos on the mantel were turned backward. Desk drawers pulled out. Contents dumped onto the floor like someone had been searching for something. Kitchen cabinets open. Plates piled carelessly on the counter. And then I saw it. A note on my refrigerator. Family takes care of each other. You'll come around. No signature. No need. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone. This wasn't a guilt trip anymore. This was a threat with a smile on it. And somewhere deep in my chest, that quiet decision from the morning hardened into something colder. If they wanted war, they were about to learn what it felt like to fight someone who was done being afraid. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at that note on the fridge. Family takes care of each other. You'll come around. It wasn't just the words. It was the confidence behind them. The assumption that no matter how far they pushed, no matter what they did, I would eventually fold. Apologize. Pay. Fix it. Like I always had. I put my phone down without calling anyone and started putting my house back together. Not because I wanted things neat, but because I needed to remind myself that this space was mine. Every book I placed back on the shelf felt like reclaiming a piece of ground. Every drawer I slid closed was a quiet refusal to let them turn my life into a staging area for their control. When I finally sat down, the anger hit. Not the explosive kind, the cold, focused kind. They hadn't just disrespected me, they had broken into my home. And my mother had laughed about it on the phone. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't about Thanksgiving anymore. This wasn't about Eli's loans. This was about power. And my parents were losing it. The doorbell rang around 9 that night. I froze. For a split second, I thought they'd come back. That my mother would be standing there with that tight smile, pretending this was just another family conversation. But when I looked through the peephole, it wasn't them. It was Eli. He looked wrong. Pale. Jittery. His eyes kept flicking over his shoulder like he expected someone to appear behind him. I opened the door and let him in without a word. He didn't sit down. He paced my living room, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, foot tapping against the hardwood like a ticking clock. Mallory, he said finally, voice low. I need to tell you something. I crossed my arms, bracing myself. What is it? They've lost it, he said. Mom and Dad? Completely. That didn't surprise me. They broke into my house, I said flatly. Eli flinched. I know. I stared at him. You know. He nodded, guilt flashing across his face. Mom was bragging about it. Said you needed a reminder where you came from. Something twisted in my chest, but I forced it down. Why are you here, Eli? He swallowed. Because they're planning something worse. That got my attention. He finally sat down on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. They're talking about cutting you out of everything, he said. The family business. Grandma's old house. Anything they think you care about. My stomach tightened. Grandma's house wasn't just property. It was summers in the garden. Dusty afternoons learning to drive down the long gravel road with my grandfather's calm voice in the passenger seat. It was history. And my mom had promised it to me for years. They can't do that, I said slowly. They think they can, Eli replied. Mom keeps saying, if she won't play ball, we'll make sure she doesn't have a choice. I let out a bitter laugh. Of course she did. Eli looked up at me, eyes shiny. I didn't ask for the car. I didn't ask you to pay my loans. I don't want to be used like this. I studied him for a moment. For years, I'd lumped him in with them. The golden child, the one who always landed on his feet. But sitting there in my living room, scared and miserable, he looked like a kid who'd never been allowed to grow up. Why tell me? I asked quietly. You're not exactly on their hit list. Because this is wrong, he said, and because I don't want to be part of it. He hesitated, then added, they're also talking about reaching out to your work, leveraging connections, trying to freeze you out professionally. That did it. This wasn't emotional manipulation anymore. This was a full-scale attack. I felt my pulse spike, but my voice stayed calm. Thank you for telling me. Eli nodded, relief and fear tangled together. Just be careful. They're not playing fair. When he left, I locked the door behind him and leaned my forehead against the wood. For years, I'd been reactive, cleaning messes, smoothing conflicts, absorbing damage. That era was over. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in a long time. My lawyer. If my parents wanted a war, I said when he answered, it's time to take the gloves off. The next few days passed in a blur. I locked down my finances, moved sensitive contracts into a separate LLC I'd set up years ago on a mentor's advice, just in case. I cut off every professional connection my parents could even theoretically touch. Then I drove out to my grandparents' favorite diner, the one with cracked vinyl seats and bacon grease permanently soaked into the counters. My grandfather was already there, black coffee in hand, sharp eyes watching me slide into the booth. I hear your mother's stirring up trouble, he said. She broke into my house, I replied, and now she's threatening to cut me out of everything. He sighed, fingers tightening around his mug. I figured it would come to this. I leaned in. I need your help. He studied me for a long moment, then smiled, a small, approving smile. Took you long enough to stand up to them, he said. We talked for an hour. By the time I left, everything had changed. My grandmother had already quietly transferred the deed to her old house into my name. My grandfather had structured the business, so my parents' control was far thinner than they believed. And my lawyer was drafting paperwork that would make it very clear my parents were no longer welcome anywhere near my life. The next morning, a thick envelope went out in the mail. Restraining order, formal notices, clear boundaries, in ink instead of emotion. As I set the mailbox flag down, my phone buzzed. A text from Eli. Thanks for standing up for yourself. I'm with you on this. I exhaled slowly. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt something shift. They thought they could corner me. They thought they could scare me. They were about to learn what happens when the person who's always cleaned up finally walks away from the mess. It took 3 days for the shockwaves to reach the center of the family. 3 days of silence from my parents. No calls, no text, no surprise visits. That alone told me everything I needed to know. They weren't reflecting. They were recalculating. When the message finally came, it didn't come from them. It came from my grandfather. Come by tonight. It's important. No emojis, no softening language. Just a sentence that carried weight because he never wasted words. I drove out just before sunset, the sky bruised purple and orange, the road familiar in a way that tugged at something old in my chest. The house sat at the end of the gravel drive like it always had, solid and unmoved by the chaos swirling around it. Warm light glowed in the windows. Inside, the living room was full. My grandparents sat together on the couch, hands clasped. Eli was there too, perched stiffly on the armchair, his knee bouncing. On the coffee table sat a stack of thick manila folders, neat and deliberate. My grandfather looked up as I stepped inside. Sit, he said. I did. My grandmother spoke first, her voice steady but tired. We've made some decisions, hard ones. My grandfather took off his glasses and set them on the table. Your parents have crossed lines I never thought they would. Breaking into your home, threatening your livelihood, using shame and fear like weapons. He paused, jaw tightening. I won't let that stand. The words landed heavier than I expected. We're cutting them off, he said plainly. The room went quiet. I blinked. What? We're updating our wills, my grandmother continued. The house, the business shares, the land. It will all go to you and Eli. My breath caught. This wasn't a gesture, it was a seismic shift. They forgot what this family stands for, my grandfather said. It's not control, it's not appearances. It's doing right by your children, and they failed you. I felt a tight mix of relief and guilt knot in my chest. They're still your kids. They stopped acting like our children the day they turned on you, he replied. I can't change who they've become, but I can protect what I built. Eli finally spoke, his voice quiet. I warned them. I told them to back off. They didn't listen. My grandfather nodded. You did the right thing. He slid the folders toward me. Deeds, trust documents, business allocations. Everything was clean, signed, and intentional. We also transferred the deed to this house into your name, my grandmother added. It always belonged with you. The clock ticked loudly in the corner, marking the end of something that had defined my life for decades. I stood, legs unsteady, and hugged them both. They held me tighter than I expected. Build your life, my grandfather said into my hair, and don't let them drag you back into their games. When I walked back to my car, the night air felt sharp and clean. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing. Freedom doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with paperwork. The fallout didn't come all at once. It unraveled in pieces, the way lies always do when there's no one left to hold them together. Within a week of my grandparents' decision, the family grapevine went from whispering to outright buzzing. My parents, who had spent decades controlling the narrative, suddenly found themselves locked out of it. Calls they expected to be returned weren't. Invitations they assumed would arrive never did. People who used to smile politely at their stories now avoided eye contact altogether. They hadn't just lost leverage. They'd lost credibility. Through a cousin, I heard that my mom was calling relatives nonstop, trying to rally support, framing herself as the wounded matriarch betrayed by an ungrateful daughter. But something had shifted. Too many people had seen too much. The Thanksgiving scene, the break-in, the threats, the restraining order papers that had quietly circulated. The illusion cracked, and no one rushed to tape it back together. My parents didn't contact me directly after that. Not an apology, not an accusation, not even a demand. Silence. Thick, unfamiliar silence. And then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. I knew who it was before I looked. Clara. She stood there with her arms folded, posture stiff, expression caught somewhere between anger and embarrassment. For years, she'd worn confidence like armor. Now it looked heavy on her. I just wanted to see if it's true, she said without greeting. About Grandma and Grandpa. It is, I replied. Her jaw tightened. So that's it, you win. I shook my head. This isn't a game, she scoffed. Everything's a game with you. You always had to prove something. I held her gaze. No, I just stopped letting you all use me to prop yourselves up. She didn't have a comeback for that. What happens now? She asked finally. That depends on you, I said, but I'm done explaining myself. She left without another word. 2 days later, Eli came by. This time, he looked lighter. Still uncertain, but no longer panicked. They're mad, he said, at everyone. But mostly at themselves, I think. I nodded. That happens when there's no one left to blame. He hesitated. I'm glad you stood up, for what it's worth. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever needed. Life didn't magically become perfect after that, but it became honest. No more bracing for manipulation. No more calculating how much peace would cost me. No more cleaning up messes I didn't make. Graham noticed the change before I did. You laugh more, he said one night as we sat on the couch, legs tangled, the house quiet in the good way. Not the polite kind, the real kind. I thought about that, about how peace feels when it's not conditional, about how love feels when it doesn't require payment. A month later, I drove out to my grandparents' house, the one that was mine now. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching the walls, the old banister, the window frames worn smooth by generations of hands. I imagined filling it with warmth instead of tension, with laughter instead of obligation. I wasn't erasing my past. I was choosing my future. The last message I ever received from my parents came from an unknown number. You've made your point. Are you happy now? I stared at it for a long time. Then I deleted it. Because happiness isn't about winning. It's about finally stepping away from a table where the only seat you're offered comes with a price. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't paying anymore.